Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas podcast. This conversation was part of FODI Digital, which was inspired by the Festival of Dangerous Ideas theme for 2020 of Dangerous Realities. FODI Digital is a conversation series with leading thinkers on today's dangerous realities. The full program was live streamed and is now available on demand for free via the FODI website. Because this was taken from the live streamed conversation in digital video call format, the audio quality is of a lower fidelity than we usually present. With normal education on hold, a mountain of public debt, high levels of long-term unemployment along with the mental health effects of isolation, the legacy of COVID-19 may fall disproportionately on the shoulders of one demographic above all others, the nation's young. Hear from three of Australia's most dynamic youth voices, Daisy Jeffrey, Audrey Mason-Hyde and Dylan Storer, as they discuss their present and future concerns in stolen inheritance.
Thank you very much. I'm coming to you today from beautiful sunny Broome, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here, which is the Yaru people, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging. Joining me today, and I'm really excited about this conversation, we've got Daisy Jeffrey, a climate justice activist and an organiser with School Strike for Climate. She's also the author of a book that's just been released, which is called On Hope, which is in all good book retailers and online as well. And we've also got Audrey Mason-Hyde. She's a poet and a climate activist. They are a poet and a climate activist. I do apologise. They join us from Adelaide this afternoon. Now, the session today is called Stolen Inheritance. Do you think that we are entitled to an inheritance? There's a lot of talk at the moment about, younger people, millennials and Gen Z being an entitled generation. Do you think, Audrey, that we as young people are entitled to an inheritance for the future?
I mean, I don't know. I would say I'm a human rights activist, kind of first and foremost, and so I believe we're all entitled to something. We're entitled to safety and we're entitled to our basic human rights and dignity. But also, are we asking the older generations, our parents, our grandparents, to sacrifice their happiness to serve our future? I mean, I guess that I'm kind of considering whether there's a really fine line between how entitled we are and how entitled we deserve to be. So I think it's a really interesting question to raise, and I think we can't ask for too much other than our safety.
Do you think that we're too entitled, or do you think that we've got the balance right at the moment?
I think we've got the balance right. I think what people say, what people are actually saying when they say that we're too entitled, is that they don't want to put in the amount of work that is required to give us a safe climate, or to actually apologize to underprivileged people who are actually put at a disadvantage by the system. And so I think it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking about, the school strike movement and activists, then I think we've got the balance right. I don't think we should all be asking for $1 million inheritance in that, traditional sense of the word, but we do deserve something we're not getting at the moment.
Well, bring Daisy in here, because you've just recently published the book called On Hope, and that outlines that outlines a vision, and congratulations on that book as well. Do you see there being a lot of what do you think the vision of hope is for young people at the moment?
I think the vision of hope for young people is a future, and I think that has been the vision of young people for many generations past. And so I think when we talk about stolen inheritance, we're talking about a generation that has a very uncertain future. When we look ahead, it's really clouded with potential disaster and bad leadership. And the thing is when we talk about a stolen inheritance, we're not saying that the generations before us failed. What we're saying is that the leadership, has not been adequate, in tackling climate change, and that politicians or people in positions of power with money, with influence, many of them have, deliberately mismanaged the situation and have pushed ahead in favor of furthering their own self-interest. And so I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about stolen inheritance. And we're also talking about, racism and, I think people are trying to come to terms with that, but I think there are a lot of conversations still to be had, and it's an uncomfortable conversation, that has to be had at length. But it's this idea of stolen inheritance is a really complex one, and it's not about entitlement, I think, and really what we want in terms of luxury going forward. It's just basically a decent existence, and the understanding that we do have a future that we're working towards.
I think back to I've just recently finished reading a book, Donald Horne's The Lucky Country, which was written back in the 1970s about Australia. And a lot of what was brought up in that book is still quite relevant today. It was basically a synopsis of what Australia is and the future of Australia, and a lot of the debate that was happening around that time in the 70s before Whitlam was elected was around what future do we want in Australia for young people at the moment. And there's a line in that book which says, Australia's a lucky country, that was along the same lines as sort of run by third-rate people that sort of just take the luck for granted and don't really work towards it. And I think that probably is still true to this day at the moment. And possibly this pandemic that we're dealing with at the moment has sort of forced a lot of those issues to come in front of us. A lot of those divisions that exist within our society at the moment. And I wanted to sort of pivot into talking about the pandemic, because it has impacted different people in a lot of different ways. Daisy, did you want to just mention a little bit about how the pandemic has just impacted you on a personal level?
Yeah, just quickly, if you hear taps running and people talking in the background, that's my family. Sorry. Would you mind repeating the question?
Yeah, just so what impact has the pandemic had on your life? I know you're currently in school. What sort of impact has that had on your 2020? Because it's impacted everyone's years differently.
Yeah. Well, I think in terms of how I'm placed, my parents have secure jobs. We've been able to stay inside, and I've been really lucky, I think. The only thing that's sort of gone into disarray is my mental health, and also year 12. So when it comes to university, it's just really uncertain at the moment. And every school is doing its own thing as we sort of try to get back to normal. And I think that the carpet has, the sort of security, year 12 is a stressful enough year anyway. But I think any minimal sort of feeling of security has been ripped away. And I think that makes us really nervous as a cohort moving forward. And also this idea that schools can sort of choose what they want to do now. It's just sort of opened the doors to greater inequality in terms of how at least my HSC, but also, different year 12 standardized tests are going to eventuate in a mark for different schools and different students. And that really worries me, because there are a lot of really incredibly smart kids who are going to come out of this, who aren't going to come out of this unscathed.
Definitely. I think that the pandemic as a whole has exposed a lot within society, and a lot of that has come back to being in education. Audrey, what are you personally seeing from your perspective in the education system at the moment, at sort of the inequalities that exist within the education system from your perspective?
Oh gosh, so many. I mean, we can, when we talk about the education system and really any institution in Australia, what we're missing if we're not talking about it is, all the Indigenous people who are disadvantaged by the systems that we've built here. And I think that's a form of stolen inheritance. Sorry, I'm going a bit grainy there. But we need to talk about the people who are, so incredibly smart. They're speaking 3 or more languages from their area, and, they're really quite big community leaders, and they're failing in school. And I know one of the people who couldn't be here today was Duan Husan, who is a really incredible kid who is super smart and seen as a failure. And I think that we have to acknowledge that. And because of the pandemic, we also have to acknowledge all of the young people who can't go to school anymore and are missing out on their education because they have bad Wi-Fi, so they can't access online school, or they don't have the right device, or they're too far away from school to get there safely every day. And there's a lot of factors that we don't consider from our position, or my position at least. I live in quite a big house. I'm really thankful for that. And my parents, we've got enough money to sustain ourselves. And so, really it's a question always in Australia of how we're going to fix the education system to better benefit those who aren't white and native English speakers, but also, how does that come into play with the pandemic? How are we going to ensure that people have the means they need to access online school and physical school? I guess. So it's really a question of who is classically disadvantaged and who is more so disadvantaged by the pandemic. And I think that overwhelmingly that's people of colour.
And I think as well, sort of looking at, you talk about the education system, or how we fix the education system in Australia, always being a repetitive topic, yet nothing seems to actually change. It comes around every election, and each side says we're going to boost funding by this much, you're not going to cut funding. And that's really, that's the level of, that's how shallow our debate is around education at the moment. It's, how much money do private schools get against public schools, or it's not actually about the system. Which, it disadvantages so many people. I know from my perspective, I didn't do a HSC, or in WA it's called a WACE, WA Certificate of Education. I actually don't have one of those technically, according to the government. I didn't graduate high school, even though I finished and I got an entry into university. I went through a different pathway, which was a big picture portfolio entry pathway. I now study at the University of Wollongong. I study international relations and journalism. And I think that shows that really what we hold up at the moment as being this ATAR score, this HSC, we hold that up as being the main way to get into university, the main way to succeed, when it really isn't the way to succeed. And it has all of these fundamental flaws, this standardized testing and different levels that it really, it's not working. It's not working for anyone apart from quite a small group of people. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I think we see a huge amount of inequality across the board, and we also see, from certainly some politicians, sincerity, but a lot of others, I think it's a problem across the board in politics. This idea of short-termism. So it's essentially just as soon as you get back into Parliament, campaigning towards the next election, and there seems to be so little intent to actually create change that benefits all students, across the board. And it makes me really uncomfortable with the leadership in this country. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what the pandemic's brought to light, for me at least, is how politicians actually understand social issues. They're so quick to jump on if there is a big crisis that starts affecting privileged white people, really. And they're so quick to jump on, but they also only really solve, in the short term, the economic crisis. They don't look at the social crisis. They don't look at the communication crisis and the mental health crisis that comes out of these events. And so, we've seen increases in job seeker and job keeper payments that were not increased when they also needed to be, when they were just New Start. And so I think, there's a huge power imbalance and a huge inequality in how our leaders actually address social issues. They know the economy, they understand the economy, because particularly Scott Morrison has come from a very economic background. And so, there's not the same kind of understanding for other elements of social issues, which is a real problem, because I think this generation probably cares about that more than the economy.
I would argue that social issues and the economy are really linked at the same time.
Yeah.
And I
Absolutely.
don't think you can have one without the other, but there seems to be that idea within places like Parliament at the moment that you can sort of have one without the other. And if you just fix the economy, social issues will follow.
Yeah.
But you sort of need to approach it on both ways. We've got a question from the audience, and I think it sort of ties into this quite well at the moment. And it's, how do you think we can come out of this pandemic better, as a better society, a better country, a better world? Daisy?
Yeah, I mean, I think, this, like, even that chat about social issues and the economy and them being intrinsically linked, we need a more holistic approach to the way we're tackling this crisis. And, I would accept that the government has done a lot of work to alleviate this pandemic, but I think what it is failing to see is an opportunity for change and to come out of this, better than we went into it. I mean, really, like, I can speak in terms of climate. It showed just how quickly our society was able to adapt to recognize and mitigate a threat. And it showed how quickly our government was able to respond. And I would ask why the government's response cannot be so quick when it comes to a climate crisis that we're living through. So we have two existential crises running alongside each other. And, it's a very difficult thing to mentally deal with one, let alone two. And of course, I think we're dealing with a lot of damage from the bushfires right now that we haven't fully been able to come to terms with and also deal with, and help those who've been directly impacted by the fires, because this pandemic has come through. And I think coming out of this, instead of simply going, let's kickstart the economy, I think we really need to examine where we go from here as a society, as a country, and think, how can we figure this out so that it is going to leave everybody in a more equal, in a better off position than before? Because what I do worry about now is that we're going to get through this pandemic, which is incredible, getting through it. But that the response from the government is going to be, when we ask them about JobKeeper, and when we ask the government about climate, they're going to say, oh, we're just focused on the economy. Why are you asking us about this now? And I think, that's a real focus from activists and academics and just people all over the country at the moment, is really reorienting, I don't know, the conversation so that we can get a better outcome after this pandemic.
Well, and I think part of the issue.
Yeah.
Sorry. Part of the issue with the term stolen inheritance, right, is I think it's kind of dwelling on this idea that we've had something taken from us, instead of the idea that our inheritance as a generation is to learn how to fix the problems we've been left with, which admittedly I don't want to have to do. I wish they were fixed. And I want to complain about, the fact that our futures have kind of been sold all day. But, how are we going to come out of this crisis and recognize as equally as we've recognized COVID-19, the climate crisis, even though it's a much longer term thing? And how are we going to, in the same way that the government has increased those payments, help bushfire affected communities and climate crisis affected communities and drought affected communities? How are we going to do that? And I think for people that were already clued into these issues, that seems like a very obvious path, but how are we going to get the government to recognize that?
We've got a question from the audience that's just come in, and it asks, how do you think we can assist low socioeconomic society to come out of this pandemic, especially when they need hours
Housing.
or like work, they need housing. Housing, that is what it is. Especially when they need housing at the moment. And I think we've seen a lot of these programs that have popped up, especially in Sydney, and there's been a trial one here in WA at the moment, with rough sleepers and getting them into hotels to help protect them from the pandemic. Obviously, the question there being is, after this pandemic's done, is the JobKeeper rate, which has now been doubled to above the poverty line, which is incredible. Welfare payments in this country are above the poverty line for the first time in decades. The government's looking at cutting them back down again so that they're below the poverty line. Is the government looking at kicking these people out of their temporary housing and back out onto the streets? How can we not do that? How can we use this pandemic as sort of a leverage for change, and sort of said, well, if the government can do this, I don't think there's any excuse for them not to do it in the future. How do you think that we can go about sort of restructuring these discussions?
I mean, I think, like, as I said before, we see this government continuing on this sort of ideological, sort of rampage. That's it seems to be their intent following this crisis. And so I think it's our responsibility as a community and as Australians, to get behind each other and to push for, this is going to sound like the most cliched political line ever, but a fair go. That's, and the idea that doubling, just getting JobKeeper, the idea that had to be the most incredible thing ever and everyone was so happy about it, just really speaks of how horrific it was before. And we also know that JobKeeper doesn't apply to everyone, particularly casual workers, and arts workers. And so I think, oh yeah, definitely, yeah. And I think, as I was saying before, I think we need to see a more holistic approach in addressing this crisis, both during and following. And we need to see a greater push from the wider community, but also those who are in positions of power, particularly politicians. It's really time to speak out, on behalf and also with, for the people that you were elected to represent. But yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a bit of an issue with our democracy and with the people we're actually we've got elected, because they get in on this false promise of everyone's going to get a fair go, but they're not there to change things. I know that, we actually need to all step up when this is kind of over and some more restrictions are lifted, and talk about how we're going to push our leaders to think about everyone in the future and what is the kind of policy that they're going to push, because we didn't elect them to ask us how to do things. We actually elected them so that they would come up with solutions. And so, if we're not seeing that from our leaders in the future, we should be electing different people, which, I already think should happen, but yeah.
Do you think that how the government has how different governments, state, territory, local governments have sort of come together in this pandemic for a crisis that we can see and hear right now, as opposed to climate change, which is a longer term crisis? We're starting to see the effects of it now. I think that's a main issue as to why we haven't seen such a large scale mobilisation of the power of government and business to go into there. Do you have any hope from how these governments have sort of come together, put differences aside and work towards? Do you have hope for seeing that for these other issues that we're seeing coming out of the pandemic, Daisy?
Yeah, I do have hope, because it really shows that we can come together and take action to address something. And it shows that, our governments, when they see a threat that absolutely has to be dealt with, that they have the capacity and the political will to work together, to work with bipartisan support for good change to help people. And the thing is that with climate change, though Australia has had fires for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years, it's, I think one of the most used words in media reports during the summer was unprecedented, because people just recognized how absolutely unbelievably horrific, that series of bushfire crises was. And I think a lot of people thought that, our generation would be the first to be drastically affected by climate change. But what we see now is that it's every generation right here, right now, that is experiencing the impact. And part of the reason we saw real drive from the public for, greater action was not only because they could see it, but also, on the news, but because they were directly impacted by the situation. And I think we had real momentum with the climate movement preceding this pandemic. And it's a way of, we have to work to maintain that momentum, during. And so I think what we should expect to see from our parliamentarians following this pandemic is a better approach to climate. And I think I would expect the wider community to hold them to that standard.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should expect to see and work to make happen the same way that we started to see the beginnings of during the bushfire crisis, but we should work to see community uprising because, we're going to start to realize and see, I hope, that crises affect us all and that climate change is not very different to COVID-19. It's just on a longer time frame. And so I think I'm hoping to bring to action the community stepping up and holding our politicians accountable. Yeah.
I wanted to run a bit of an observation that I've noticed recently, which has been a little bit of a crack, I guess, that we've seen in the national unity that's sort of come together from this. And I think it may speak to a broader issue within society. And that's that, we're starting to see some politicians, some conservative politicians sort of question the motives and the moves behind some more progressive politicians' stances on particular issues, mainly sort of the Victorian Premier, Daniel Andrews, and his government stance on lifting restrictions and whatnot. And I've seen some of that pick up after a lot of pundits in the conservative media and particular sections of the media have started to question what these government actions are. We've started to see some of those protests in America. It started to filter into an Australian audience. And that started to see these politicians react to what's being said on certain media platforms. Do you see that as being, do you agree with that observation? And do you see that as being a broader issue in the sort of balance of power in society at the moment in Australia? We'll start with Audrey.
In terms, okay.
In terms of like conservatives questioning the motives of progressives, right?
Yeah, well, just bringing up different perspectives and sort of dragging the political discussion from being in the centre or being in the left wing to sort of dragging it so that we're having a discussion more in the right wing frame of mind.
Well, I think there is this kind of attitude that I've seen, which is that catering to younger generations is kind of pointless or is motivated by the idea that by the next election, some of our school strike leaders and people on the left of politics who are younger are going to be voting. And I honestly think, there is this huge imbalance between the idea of doing politics for authentic beliefs and doing politics to gain power. And my personal opinion, I would say that our current leaders are kind of in because they want power, because we haven't seen a huge amount of action actually come from them. But there's a huge media imbalance as well. And so I think it's a really interesting thing to explore how we all see our own side. I think we kind of live in these echo chambers, and if we're only seeing opinions from our own side of politics, we're not actually getting a grasp of the motives of the other side or of the other side at all. And so I find it really difficult to talk from a conservative viewpoint because I generally read left newspapers and things like that personally.
Daisy?
Yeah, I think part of the imbalance that we see in the reporting, we see what we saw in the US was nuts with those protesters, but they were very tiny, very tiny in terms of in terms of how large the American population is. And I think maybe that, trickle in to Australia was, I think there were about 6 people yesterday in Martin Place. And if there'd been a protest, on climate like that, it would have gotten absolutely no media attention at all. But because it was just so, because they were protesting the kind of, isolation and social distancing measures, the media reported on it. And so I think, it's something I heard the other day was, it's up for the media. They're supposed to look at both sides of the story and then look out the window and try to figure out what's true. And I think a lot of what we see from the media is sensationalized reporting that makes something seem a lot bigger than it is and a lot more exciting. And what they're also trying to do is keep up with a 24-hour news cycle when it comes to the internet and social media. And then another factor playing into this is, the Murdoch empire, which I've heard at least 3 times this week being referred to as a political organization that hires journalists. And so I think we see an enormous imbalance in the way our media reports on different situations, different people, ideologies. And unfortunately, we see a lot of self-interest and selfishness fueling those motives. And so, of course, we do see this imbalanced political debate. And it just, none of us here on this call have been around for very long. I've been around for 17 and a bit years. But what I've seen from our politicians has been, an unbelievable lack of empathy and a lot of insincerity in terms of actually trying to make our country a better place. And I think the same can be said for a lot of political leaders around the world. And I think we need to really revisit how we do politics and the kind of etiquette that we use when we're, trying to lead a country. Yeah.
And just going back to, if we're talking about, our futures and inheritance, I would say we deserve to, in a democratic society or a society that claims it's democratic, we deserve to inherit a fair democracy. And I don't think that's what we have at the moment. And I think this is kind of speaking to a question from Karen in the audience, which is that, do we think we need to prove to Australian voters that they have a good grasp of data and science and not just the law? And I think that we don't necessarily in Australia, because our media is monopolized by Murdoch, and that, I wouldn't say it rigs the political system, because it doesn't, but it contributes to a lot of misinformation within politics and within our democracy. And I think if we're going to ever have a truly democratic society, we need to listen and hear in the mainstream media from all kinds of media sources, not just those owned by one man who has very right-wing leanings, Yeah.
I think, and as well, in Malcolm Turnbull's new book and Kevin Rudd, we've seen most of the former prime ministers over the last few years, and there has been a lot of former prime ministers over the last 6 years, have sort of come out and said of the damaging role that Murdoch media can have on Australian democracy. Yet there isn't a lot of discussion about that in Parliament. It seems to be something that gets discussed after you leave, because you don't have any more skin in the game. I am a little bit wary of the time at the moment. We have about 5 minutes left from the session, but we have a question here from Laura, and she wants to know if any of us plan on going into politics in the future, and if you do go there, what you'd do differently. I guess we'll start with Daisy.
Look, I don't know. I think, the saying is, if you want to go into politics, if you want to be a politician and that's what you want to go into straight in life, then you should never go into politics. And as far as, and I think, I've always wanted to make a difference in the world, but I think as, my plans now are to help people, and I'm not sure where that's going to lead, whether it's going to lead to policy change or eventually into, politics, potentially as a politician, some decades into the future. I don't know, but I think, externally we have the capacity to create change, and it's difficult, but, we saw that with the marriage equality campaign, and that's, movements like those that really help, people. And of course they have their own flaws. But those are things that I want to be part of, and helping to create the change, for the future.
Yeah.
Audrey?
I don't know if I would go into politics. It almost feels like some kind of betrayal to the activist side of me. But then, I've also been kind of considering it more as of late, because there's so much that already I feel I would do. And of course, this is from an external point of view. I haven't actually been in politics, but, I feel I would do better. And it's kind of hard because it takes so long to get things done externally. But I think it is a fight worth pursuing and a fight worth fighting. And for that reason, I don't think I will be going into politics, but I will try to change things still and help as many people as possible. I'm kind of on the same page as you, Daisy. I don't know. Politics seems a bit messy and kind of cursed in a way.
And I think
so
that
I'd like to see
it's
what else I
create.
can do.
I think politics at the moment can create a system where it's not as welcoming to good people. And for politics to work, we do need more good people in the system. I think what we'll finish off with is this question from the audience, from Carlos. And it's, what would you like to see the generation following our generation, what would you like to see that generation receive as an inheritance, our potential future kids in the future at some point in time? What would you like to see them receive as an inheritance from our generation, Daisy?
I think I'd like to see, I'd love them to have the promise of a decent future, of, working to create and further the things that they love. And I hope a more equal footing in life as each other, across the board, regardless of ethnicity, beliefs, and that's what I really hope for.
Audrey?
Yeah, I guess I hope to build or maintain a level of safety for the next generation, in terms of a safe climate, but also a safe political climate, if I'm staying on the same page. And that would be having the human rights that we currently don't have for everyone, and having a sense of more equality than we currently have. On a personal note, I want future non-binary and gender diverse kids to be able to say that from a really young age and be fine with it and have no issues. But we can't have that and other, social issues come to pass until we can guarantee that they'll be breathing safe air and drinking safe water. And so I think our first fight is the climate fight, and I want to leave my children and grandchildren a safe climate.
Definitely, I agree with that 100%, and hopefully throughout our lives we can help do that. I'd like to thank both of you, because it's been a really interesting discussion, and we could have gone on for a lot longer. Unfortunately, we can't. But Daisy, Jeffrey, Audrey Mason-Hyde, and myself, Dylan, Stora, and it's just really a great discussion. So thank you very much for joining us all and being a part of this discussion here at the Festival of Dangerous Ideas.
This session was recorded as part of FODI Digital, presented by the Ethics Centre. The Ethics Centre delivers programs and experiences designed to bring ethics to the centre of your life. We offer free counselling for individuals, consulting, leadership and development services. As a non-profit charity, we rely heavily on donations to continue our work, which can be made via our website. Thank you.